I have learned that people imagine wealth as a kind of insulation, a double-glazed window between you and the cold air of doubt. They assume that when you reach a certain number, 7 figures, 8, whatever abstraction they prefer, the questions stop. The mirror becomes kinder. Loneliness loses its teeth. Desire becomes simple because it can be purchased, scheduled, curated. I used to believe that too, at least a little, or I wouldn't have chased it so hard. But on the night I met her, standing on the balcony of my house in the hills above Los Angeles, the city spread out below like a circuit board of restless light, I felt more exposed than I had in years. The party was my idea, which already tells you something about me. I don't like crowds, but I like the idea of being seen as someone who hosts them. My friends, most of them men my age, some older, a few younger but already hardened by ambition, circulated with practiced ease, their laughter loud and deliberate. I watched from a distance, drink in hand, rehearsing my own life in my head the way I sometimes do when I'm tired. Self-made, tech-adjacent investments, divorced but amicable, no kids, tasteful house, quiet cars. A life that looks complete from the outside. A life that, if I'm honest, often feels like a well-appointed waiting room. She arrived late, which I noticed only because the energy shifted. It's not that everyone turned to look, nothing so cinematic, but conversation stuttered, as if someone had adjusted the lighting without telling us. She was with a friend of a friend, someone I barely knew, and she moved through the space without trying to claim it. That was what struck me first, not her youth, though it was obvious, but her lack of hunger for attention. She looked around the way someone does when they are curious rather than acquisitive, taking things in, filing them away. When we were introduced, she smiled and said my name like she was testing its weight. Her voice was lower than I expected, steady. She asked me what I did, and when I gave my usual vague answer, investments, mostly, she didn't nod politely or pivot to something else. She asked what kind, and then why, and then told me about the nonprofit she worked for, something related to urban planning and community spaces. I remember thinking that she spoke about it the way I used to speak about my first company, before exits and multiples and caution dulled the edges. I also remember, with a sharpness that still makes me wince, the moment I realized how young she was. It wasn't a number, it was a reference she made to a show she'd grown up watching, something that had premiered when I was already in my 40s. The math happened automatically, mercilessly. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to retreat before anyone could accuse me of something unseemly. But she was still talking, her eyes bright, and I was still listening, and the space between us felt, inexplicably, easy. We didn't exchange numbers that night. I told myself that was restraint, maturity, proof that I wasn't the man people whisper about at dinners. But a week later, when she emailed me, she'd gotten my address from our mutual friend, I felt a rush of relief so strong it embarrassed me. The email was simple, almost formal. She thanked me for the conversation, mentioned a book I'd recommended, said she'd like to continue it sometime. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, aware of the calculus already spinning up in my head, optics, power dynamics, the inevitable assumptions. I replied anyway. Dating her felt like stepping into a different climate. We met for coffee first, then dinners that lasted too long, then walks where the conversation meandered without agenda. She asked me questions no one had asked me in years, not because they were particularly novel but because they were unguarded. What did I want when I was her age? When had I last been afraid? What did I miss about my marriage, if anything? I answered honestly, or as honestly as I could, and she listened without trying to fix or flatter. In return, she told me about her parents' divorce, her student loans, the way she felt suspended between ambition and exhaustion. Our differences were obvious, sometimes comical. She teased me about my music tastes. I had to Google half the slang she used. But there was also a strange alignment, a sense that we were both standing slightly outside our expected lanes. Of course, the world noticed. My friends were polite but cautious, their jokes edged with concern. My ex-wife, when she heard, laughed in a way that was not entirely kind. Strangers assumed things outright. I saw it in waiters' raised eyebrows, in the way conversations paused when we walked into a room. I became hyper-aware of my own gestures, my tone, the distance between us in public. I worried constantly about what she was giving up by being with me, about whether my wealth and age cast a shadow she couldn't see yet. And then there were the moments alone, the quiet ones, when the doubts softened. We would sit in my kitchen late at night, her feet tucked under her, talking about nothing and everything. She would touch my hand absent-mindedly, and I would feel a surge of tenderness so intense it scared me. Desire was part of it, of course, but it was threaded with something else. A longing to be known without the armor I'd built. I found myself telling her stories I hadn't told anyone, not because they were secret but because they felt irrelevant to the man I'd become. She made them matter again. Still, there were fractures. Our timelines didn't align. She talked about wanting to live abroad, maybe go back to school. I thought about my parents' health, about legacy, about how many reinventions I realistically had left. When we argued, it was often about things neither of us could change. I worried she would wake up one day and see me as an anchor. She worried, she admitted once, that she would never be able to fully understand my past, that it would always be a closed book. The hints were there, even then, though I didn't recognize them for what they were. The way she sometimes fell silent when the conversation turned to money, not out of discomfort but calculation. The way she asked, gently, about my will, about who would inherit what. The way she lingered over old photos in my study, asking about people I hadn't thought of in years. I told myself this was normal, that intimacy invites curiosity. I told myself I was projecting my own insecurities onto her. It wasn't until the night she finally told me the truth that I understood how carefully we had both been circling it. We were sitting on that same balcony where we'd first met, the city humming below us. She was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, and I felt a familiar dread settle in my stomach. When she spoke, her voice was steady but strained. She told me about her father, about the business he'd started and lost, about the man who had invested in it years ago and walked away just before it collapsed. She told me that man was me. The revelation landed slowly, piece by piece. She had known who I was from the beginning, had recognized my name at the party and said nothing. She hadn't planned to meet me, hadn't set out to entangle herself in my life, but once it happened she hadn't known how to stop it. Her interest in my past, in my finances, wasn't opportunism but something closer to reckoning. She wanted to understand the shape of the forces that had shaped her own life, to see if the man she was falling for was the same one who had, inadvertently, broken her family. I listened, stunned, 1,000 reactions colliding inside me. Guilt, defensiveness, a strange, aching sadness. I thought of decisions I'd made with a spreadsheet open, of risks mitigated and losses absorbed. I thought of the ripple effects I'd never seen. When she finished, she looked at me with a mixture of fear and resolve, as if bracing for judgment. What surprised me most was the relief. The sense that the tension I'd been carrying finally had a name. I told her about my own regrets, about the ways I'd learned to compartmentalize harm. I didn't ask her to absolve me, and she didn't. We sat there, the city indifferent to our small reckoning, and I realized that the age difference, the wealth, the gossip, those were surface complications. The real challenge had always been whether we could hold the truth of each other without flinching. I didn't sleep that night. After she went home, after the city lights dimmed into something more skeletal and honest, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying not just her confession but my entire adult life, recontextualized. It's unsettling how quickly memory reorganizes itself when given a new frame. Deals I'd categorized as prudent withdrawals now felt like quiet abandonments. Conversations I barely remembered suddenly pulsed with imagined aftershocks. I had always told myself that distance, emotional, financial, temporal, was a form of professionalism. Now I wondered how often it had simply been avoidance. By morning, the familiar instinct to control the narrative kicked in. I checked my phone, half expecting a message from her, half dreading one. There was nothing. I brewed coffee I didn't drink and paced rooms that had been designed to soothe but suddenly felt accusatory in their openness. For the first time in years, my house felt like a monument to decisions rather than a refuge from them. When she did text later that day, it was characteristically measured. She said she needed time, that she hadn't told me to provoke guilt or extract apology, but because continuing without honesty had begun to feel like a betrayal of herself. I admired that, even as it terrified me. I told her I understood, and meant it in the abstract way men often do when the alternative is panic. The days that followed were a study in restraint. I didn't call. I didn't send long explanations that would have served only to soothe my own discomfort. I returned to work with a mechanical diligence, sitting in meetings where younger men pitched visions of disruption while I nodded, the irony not lost on me. More than once, I caught myself wondering about their unseen consequences, the lives that would bend quietly around whatever success or failure followed. It was an unfamiliar kind of humility, and it didn't sit easily. When we finally met again, it was at her suggestion, in a small park not far from where she lived. We sat on a bench, leaving a deliberate space between us, like negotiators aware of precedent. We didn't define our relationship after that conversation. We drifted into something quieter, more tentative.